Welcome back to episode 5 of the Lantern Sports Podcast, hosted by the Lantern Sports Desk at The Ohio State University. I'm Stephen Kishpaugh, Assistant Sports Editor to The Lantern. Joining me, as always, to my left, Lantern TV Sports Producer, Casey Smith, Sports Editor, Jacob Benge, across from me, and to my right, Assistant Lantern TV Sports Producer, Gabe Burggraf. Gentlemen, as always, it's a pleasure to be here. Before we get started, as I like to do, just talk about news from around Ohio State athletics. A few Buckeye spotlights were given out this week, just based on notable stats. Like, for example, women's volleyball player Kylie Murr moved into third all-time in Ohio State program history for career digs against number 3 Nebraska on Saturday. Max Trejo, redshirt freshman goalkeeper from Mexico City, Mexico, started 2 matches last week and allowed 1 goal in over 180 minutes played. And then I think this is a nice segue into what we want to talk about. Cade Stover, football player, senior from Mansfield, Ohio, caught 2 touchdowns, his first 2 career touchdowns in the 52-21 win Saturday night over Wisconsin. So, gentlemen, we're going to do things a little differently, as we decided about 5 minutes before we hit record on this thing. We just kind of want to analyze what we've seen from Ohio State this year and just what exactly we think they can bring to the table. Obviously, Saturday night, I don't even think it was as close as the scoreline indicated. They got Wisconsin broke off a 75-yard touchdown run as soon as the second-string defense went in. So the scoreline honestly is not reflective of how badly Ohio State could have won that game. And from what I've seen, aside from the Notre Dame game where obviously they struggled trying to just, settle in, start playing without Jackson Smith and Jigba because he got hurt early in that game, they started to settle in, and the offense that we saw last year looks just as explosive this year with added weapons like Cade Stover and like running backs such as Mayan Williams, because Ryan Day has said multiple times, Jacob, I think you heard him say this a couple of times at a press conference, that Mayan Williams has had one of the best camps he saw over the summer, if not the best one. And he's been a great weapon. Cade Stover's been a great weapon. Jacob, you were at the presser today. What did you hear from Ryan Day?
Yeah, Ryan Day talked a lot about how Ohio State's offensive weapons have played a big key part in how they've gone 4-0 so far this season. I think today, on the Tuesday press conference with Ryan Day, a big focus was on that secondary and the cornerback's health. He touched on how Jordan Hancock's still a week or 2 away from getting onto the field. He said he hopes to have Denzel Burke and Cameron Brown return to the field this week after they were held out with respective injuries. We saw Denzel Burke with a cast on his right hand. Lathan Ransom also is someone who in the safeties room is looking to get back on the field as well. But, as you were mentioning, Stephen, we saw other contributors step up. Tanner Mcallister was someone who stuck out to me just because, he grabbed that interception, the first one of his Buckeye career since coming to Ohio State from Oklahoma State, played under Jim Knowles' defense there with the Cowboys beforehand. So he's taught his teammates just, how to play under Knowles' new defense, that 4-2-5 look that's held teams to, a relatively low standard so far, but Ohio State's offense, as you were kind of even talking about, I don't know if there are many teams in the country that can really compete and stand toe-to-toe with Ohio State's offense, because you can have the saying go either way: the best offense is a great defense, or the best defense is a great offense. I don't know about you, but Ohio State's offense is looking pretty dominant.
Well, Jacob, you talk about no Lathan Ransom, a late kind of. For us, we didn't know because the status report didn't reflect that he was unavailable. A late kind of inquiry into who's going to play in that secondary and who's going to make an impact. You talked about Tanner Mcallister with that pick, and that kind of sparked that game. We talked about it after the game. You jump out, you score, whether you wanted the ball to start or not. You score, you get a stop, you score, and then Wisconsin's in a hole. And going into the game, you didn't think that Wisconsin was going to necessarily throw the ball down the field all over the Buckeyes and win a kind of shootout game. That just wasn't the way that Wisconsin would need to edge it out and secure a victory in Columbus. But you talk no Lathan Ransom. You saw Josh Proctor coming up to the line a lot in this game and getting to the running back, because there were a lot of handoffs to Braylon Allen and a lot of things that could have been bigger gains that weren't, because the defense was solid and tackles were made that were not made last year.
Did we expect that type of thumping that we saw on Saturday?
I predicted 45-21. I gave Ohio State some credit, but Ohio State obviously took my score prediction to a different level.
I think my 52-17 prediction was reflective of how I thought the game was going to go, because truly and honestly, Casey, I just didn't see a way where, Wisconsin's offense, as good on the ground as they are, if they can't get that consistently going, and they weren't going to be able to keep up with what C.J. Stroud is able to do with guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka.
But did we expect 28-0 just at the beginning of the second quarter, where Ohio State, they put a team like Wisconsin, who has the best one of the best defenses in the country, they put them away and just pretty much mopped the floor with them? Did we expect that?
No.
Yeah,
I don't think so.
Yeah, to be fair, I did not expect it to happen as quickly as it did.
So that's why, Ohio State's quick strike ability, obviously you saw it scoring 11 touchdowns and 12 drives against Toledo. We have to put a little bit of a note that Ohio State's facing Toledo. It's not the big bad boys of the Big Ten that they're facing. Wisconsin, they were in the running to represent the West in Indianapolis just in, a couple months' time. We'll blink and it'll be here. But, Ohio State looked dominant, and I mean dominant. Their defense, they fly around to the ball. They don't – the one thing that really plagued Ohio State's defense last year, especially against Oregon and Michigan, they got beat against the same game plan. There were no steps to make adjustments whatsoever to where C.J. Verdale goes off, Oregon, they run for over 200. And Ohio State's defense and their secondary looks lost. Michigan, Hassan Haskins, 5 touchdowns, over 200 yards between him and Blake Corum, now the starting backup in Ann Arbor. They get beat 42-27, which always seems to pop up in our TikTok comments every time we make a post. It's I love the troll jobs. It's amazing. Keep them coming, please. They're so entertaining.
Dude, the interactions are what make the algorithm happy.
Dude, so, yeah, Jim Knowles, they called him a mad scientist. I can't even imagine how many times. And I think you're kind of starting to see that on display. And more so, not necessarily his scheme, but his ability to motivate players to turn Tommy Eichenberg into a Nagurski Award winner and also, co-defense player of the week.
Indeed.
So, he kind of had an outburst in the Rose Bowl, 17 tackles, but now he is a dominant force, and he's 8th in the Big Ten in tackles. And I think Ohio State is the most complete team in the country.
Well, and you talk about the transition with Knowles. A lot of those games, the Buckeyes did not go out and win the game and shut it down in the first half. Those were games where they had to play catch-up. Michigan, Oregon. You felt like they were still in the game at points, but they had to make a play to get back within striking distance. And going out and basically putting your foot down, not only on offense, scoring better than, the offense didn't play great in those big games when it needed to score a lot of points and the defense wasn't going to provide stops. But also the defense, securing that victory really in the first half. Really, the first quarter of that game was really over after the first 15 minutes.
Yeah, and that's a testament to Tanner Mcallister, who said people are going to start to see that this defense can go out and win games. And I think when you're facing the Georgias and the Alabamas, I don't know what y'all's opinions on Big Game Boomer are, but I love the content every week. Top 50 loudest and quietest stadiums, top 50 pizza spots on campus. That's my personal favorite. But his projection was Ohio State playing NC State in the Peach Bowl. He's been high on NC State the entire time, the Wolfpack. But then Ohio State facing off against Georgia in the national championship. And I think even though my Final Four doesn't match his Final Four, I think those are two of the clear-cut teams in college football that are in the upper echelon. Alabama, you've seen they're vulnerable, they're beatable. And even Georgia this past week, surrendering 22 points to Kent State. And I think that turned out to be a 17-point victory, 39-22. But, Ohio State, if they can put on performances like that, you might see Ryan Day hoisting the national championship trophy at the end of the year.
I want y'all to hear this number. It's the number 4, and it's in. If you haven't read the media guide, you should, because 4 represents what Ohio State's defense is top 25 nationally. They are number 18 in yards per game given up, so total defense. Scoring defense, they're 21st. Passing defense, they're 22nd. And tackles for loss, they're 17th. And here's another crazy stat that really just opened my eyes to just how dominant Ohio State has been playing. They've only let 12 plays go for negative yards on offense the entire season. 12 plays. That is second in the nation, right behind Georgia, because they've let up 9. But Ohio State and Georgia have let up the same amount of sacks with 2. I think the most unsung aspect of this Ohio State team has been the offensive line. They have looked dominant in every regard in regards to pass protection, blocking for the run. I mean, we heard all about how great Wisconsin's defensive line was, and Ohio State just pretty much, I wouldn't want to say bullied them, but they handled them pretty well. And I think as the season goes on, we're going to see how that offensive line comes into play when playing a potential team like Georgia or like Michigan that has a great defensive line.
Jacob, do you think Ohio State's a top 4 team?
Yes, they're a top 4 team. They're in my CFP at the moment.
Do you think they're a top 2 team?
Top 2 team? I would argue on any given Saturday, yes. I don't know if we've seen too many of their vulnerabilities. I mean, you mentioned how we've seen it with Alabama and maybe even a little bit with Georgia, but I can't really pinpoint one aspect of Ohio State's offense or defense that hasn't, stuck out like a sore thumb. Perhaps like last year where we talked about the secondary and perhaps even stopping the run. I think we'll maybe find that out here in the next couple of weeks with Rutgers and Michigan State before the bye week. If I just haven't seen one area. I guess if I had to highlight one area, it's the defensive line. I look at the sack numbers and Ohio State's brought down 9 sacks. I think to me that's a little low. I think of the moments where JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, they blow up the pocket. They're getting there. They're getting, inches away from that quarterback, but they're not bringing them down. But, Ohio State's not worried about that. They're not worried about the turnovers that they've got in the last 2 games. But, yeah, I haven't seen one aspect of Ohio State that's been the weakest more than the others.
I mean, I think the biggest thing that you can point to, yes, that's an issue that, you're not playing – Ohio State, let's not – beat around the bush. Ohio State has a very favorable schedule. Notre Dame, they cave in big games. Wisconsin was the first test. Penn State's going to be a big test. Michigan, obviously. Every year the game is, very rarely is it sort of a blowout or a mismatch like it was last year. So I think the one thing that you can pinpoint to, when Ohio State's playing the big boys of college football, you got to limit the big plays. You can't let Stetson Bennett or Bryce Young or these type quarterbacks torch you for a 50-yard play. Like I just said, Jim Knowles, he's good at adjusting, but if you give a Nick Saban-led team or a Kirby Smart-led team any sort of momentum in the college football playoff for sure, you could find yourself on your heels and trying to play catch-up, Gabe, like you mentioned, against Oregon and Michigan, and you could slip up, and that's where, like I said before, when I could see Ryan Day hoisting the national championship trophy, that's where I could see him hanging his head and going back to the drawing board in the offseason again.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. You talk about not giving up the big play. What did we see against Toledo? What did we see against Notre Dame? What worked for them? The quarterback run was pretty efficient for them. Now, they didn't score a lot, but it gained some chunk yardage that they desperately needed against the Buckeyes to do anything. So, you tighten down the hatches here and there, but like you said, not playing a very, I think it's fair to say, not top-tier competition may bite you in the end because you're looking at Penn State even. Penn State's not a whiteout. It's not a night game. So you look at that. You look at Michigan being depleted on the defensive end. Of course, that's always a dogfight. It's a rivalry game. But at home, after getting the pants beat off of you up in Ann Arbor, the Buckeyes are going to want to come out and win that game and really be motivated to dominate that game in a way they haven't in a while. At the same time, you talk about not potentially seeing any vulnerabilities on either side of the ball right now. They might not see any vulnerabilities until Indianapolis has already been in the rearview mirror and they have to go play a Georgia or an Alabama. So you saw it all year last year with the defense as something that needed to be fixed and didn't. The problem, and you're going to have to come up with a solution for it, if on the fly in a game. You're in the second half trailing Georgia by 7, and there's something that you just can't stop.
And Jacob, do you think Ohio State's offense is good enough to compensate for big plays allowed on defense? Do you think they can sort of overcome that struggle where if a team like Alabama or Georgia, they go down, quick strike, they have all the momentum, they're up 7-0. Do you think Ohio State's offense can pretty much outscore and cover the defense?
I think many people will tell you yes, just because of Ohio State's offense being last year the top offense in the country. But I think of that Michigan game mostly. I mean, that offense was still very, potent, but it got stopped. And when it got stopped, Ohio State's defense couldn't get the stops that it needed in order to stay in the game. So I would have to say no, Yeah.
The one big thing that's been on my mind, Stephen, as we're talking about this Ohio State offense, Jackson Smith and Jigba, do you think, dare I say, do you think he should pull a Nick Bosa and sit out the rest of the year and then just wait for the NFL draft?
I think it's – look, I'm not going to sit here and say that somebody who's played this game his entire life, doesn't love the university that he goes to and, is only looking out for himself. Like, if Jackson Smith and Jigba were to sit out for the rest of the season, I know it's because he probably had lots of talks with a lot of people and found that would be the best decision for him personally moving forward. Now, having said that, I think at some point he will come back, mostly because, if one of Ohio State's, current starting receivers like Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, et cetera, if one of them go down, then even though the wide receiver room is still good, it starts getting a little more thin, and that's when having a Jackson Smith and Jigba becomes so valuable.
Well, you talk about the wide receiver room becoming a little bit thin. It seems a little packed if you throw Jackson Smith and Jigba back in there, just looking at the last couple of games. So, the question becomes also from a coaching standpoint, if he's not going to be 100%, are you throwing him out there where he might not be as effective at 70% as Marvin Harrison Jr., the weapons that you have and the weapons you've developed in his absence, especially since when's the last time he's played, we think, at 100%?
The Rose Bowl.
Right. So the question becomes, having him in there is always going to be a net positive. But is there another way that you can kind of figure out how to distribute the ball and keep everybody in sync? Does it affect everybody else? Mayan, Travion, Cade Stover now receiving touchdowns.
No, not at all. I think until he's 100%, which I don't think Ryan Day would trot him out there against Toledo if he weren't 100%. So you have to think there's something re-aggravated there. But, I mean, for his sake, if I'm Jackson Smith and Jigba, I might consider sitting out the rest of the year. I mean, because the latest draft stock board I saw, mock draft, I saw him going 11th overall. I'm pretty sure the average pay grade for the 11th overall pick is probably about, I'd say probably 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million.
Ask Chris Olave.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, whatever Chris Olave just got. So, I mean, are you willing to risk injury, something that could derail your career, and I mean that takes away from any potential opportunity that you have moving forward? Or do you pull Nick Bosa, sit out? Oh no, the fans are upset. You're sitting out. You're quitting on the team. Meanwhile, they'll still see Ohio State in the Final Four in the college football playoff, led by Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka, who are two of the top 10 receivers in the country. Cade Stover's getting in the passing game. Mayan Williams and Trayvon Henderson. Imagine if Mayan Williams would get 20 carries a game. Imagine what he could do, dude. He is a bull. He runs with such force. And, I mean, don't get me wrong. His physical traits are next to none, him and Trayvon Henderson both. But I think their mental game is something that doesn't get a lot of praise. You were talking about the offensive line. Well, it takes a good running back to be able to see those holes that are getting created and make the one cut and know when to cut and know when to get out of bounds, know when to look for contact, and both those guys do. So getting back to my original point, I think if Jackson Smith and Jigba sits, Ohio State's still fine. They're still the top offense in the country. I believe this week they're number 1 in yards, and they're 3rd in points per game. So, yeah, I mean, I think with Jackson Smith, like you mentioned, if JSN's in the lineup, it's a net positive. That's one more weapon at Ohio State's disposal that you have to worry about. But shout out Griffin Strom. There's a decreasing stock of Farmer Gronk if JSN's in the lineup.
I think you bring up a good point. It's a good dilemma. I don't even know if I would say it's a good dilemma. It's a tough dilemma. And I think in a roundabout way, we're answering the question posed earlier, where Ohio State's vulnerabilities lay. And I think back to the 2020 national championship game against Alabama. Injuries plagued the Buckeyes in that game, and that was one of the biggest reasons why they lost was injuries, COVID, and just the overall health of their players. So, Gabe, as you mentioned, when Indianapolis may roll around for Ohio State to get back to the Big Ten championship game, I think then we'll know the health of the team, and I think that may be the biggest vulnerability for Ohio State in its quest for a national championship and another Big Ten title to get back to Indianapolis is how healthy is Ohio State? We're seeing it in the secondary. It's something that they're dealing with. They're getting through it at the moment. They've got depth, but when it comes to the big games against Alabama, we've seen it before. Injuries overcame them in that game. I don't know if that'll happen again this year. They got to get there first, but that might be my reasoning there. Injuries for Ohio State.
Let the record reflect that even if Ohio State was at 100% health, that nobody was beating that Alabama team that year. Ohio State was mismatched.
I don't know. Trey Sermon goes down on the first offensive drive for Ohio State. I don't know. That's a different ball game. It's kind of like the Notre Dame game. Ryan Day said with Jackson Smith and Jibba going out early, they had to flex their game plan in a way because they didn't plan for JSN to be out of that game. Trey Sermon in that game too. I think with him in there, it could be a different ball game.
Do you think Tough Borland holds up on Devontae Smith?
I think Trey Sermon would run a little bit far over Alabama's defense. I don't know about your question there, but
I think it's interesting you bring up Trey Sermon because the game plan does change. We've seen that when Jackson Smith and Jigba was third option, he flourished there. And this year as the number 1 option, he hasn't had the opportunity to showcase himself as a true number 1 receiver leading the core. But I think it'll be interesting to see when he does come back, if he does come back, how that affects the rest of the wide receiver rotation. We've seen, Stover, Fleming finally getting some action in the end zone. So, it'll be interesting to see how that pairs up with Buckeyes front runner for the Heisman right now, C.J. Stroud. And, he's been deadly accurate. We haven't even talked about his first interception of the season. That came late in the first half. He's been deadly accurate, and I think that's another thing. 17 to 27 wasn't great percentage-wise for what he's done recently because he's been great recently. But, everybody slips up now and then, and, just threw one pick against the Badgers.
And let the record show that during the postgame press conference, Ryan Day took full blame for that interception. He's the one that said that he was pushing CJ in the offense to try to score with not a lot of time left, and he was like, "Yeah, I mean, like that was on me. I told him to be aggressive." So looking forward to Saturday. Rutgers Scarlet Knights. I don't think any of us have much doubt about who's going to end up on top, but I will say that I think this will be a much more pass-heavy game than we've seen recently because Rutgers currently has the second best rush defense in the FBS. They're only allowing about 56.5 yards per game on the ground. So I think this will be an aired-out game for Ohio State. And this weekend, see the spread is 40. I'm picking Ohio State to win, picking Ohio State to cover. Go 55-10.
55. Oh,
whoa! We're going reverse.
Whoa, we're going reverse now. So I don't want to
reverse order this
steal
time.
Anybody. Oh no, because this you do realize over under 60, which is very interesting with this. So I'll give that to you, Casey. It's a 40-point spread, but 60 points total. So they must not think Ohio State's going to score like they did against Wisconsin.
Well, I think Ohio State hits the over by themselves. I think they end up having a 60 burger, if you was it a 60 steak because it's a 50 burger. I'll go 60.
They both sound good.
Yeah, I know, 60 steak.
Hungry, yeah.
So I think C.J. Stroud does his thing. I think regardless of the 56 yards given up on the ground per game, I think Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson do their thing. They're not going to both have 100 yards each per se, but I mean, it's a homecoming game. The last year's homecoming game against Maryland, it was an absolute rout. I think that trend continues against Rutgers this Saturday. Ohio State obviously has never lost to Rutgers, and they march that on this Saturday with a 66-13 win.
Man, the score predictions are back. It's homecoming. 100 years of the shoe this Saturday.
Jacob, what's your favorite memory of the shoe?
Favorite memories in the shoe? I think back to, watching the Pat McAfee show so often, almost daily. It goes back to my freshman year at Ohio State, the Ohio State-Penn State game, late November, last home game of that season. I woke up early to go watch ESPN Game Day, of which Pat McAfee was there. Points in my direction when our little section there in the crowd were yelling for him, and so that was very cool. Went over to watch the Fox Big Noon show thereafter. Caught a little bit of the Big Ten show there. It was just a great game, great atmosphere. Last game as a fan, quote unquote. So yeah, there's a lot of good themes here this weekend. I'm very intrigued by your score prediction for Ohio State to put up 60, especially against a conference opponent. Now, I think back to the 2018 Michigan game, of which Gabe was saying that Ohio State this year could and should justifiably almost reminisce. I think Ohio State against Rutgers this week wins 49-7. Like I said last week, Ohio State has to put up 40 as often as it can. Still needs to get a shutout. It's hard to predict a shutout. So I go Ohio State 49-7. Marvin Harrison gets back into the touchdown column with 2 of them, 2 receiving touchdowns, and I think there's going to be a strip sack and a scoop and score. Jack Sawyer.
Those are some interesting props, Jacob. I mean, man, I'm on the spot now. Because, I lost my undefeated prediction record last week. I thought this was going to be one of those, the atmosphere, it's a night game, it's a blackout. You're going to get some weather, some precipitation. That did not happen. We still have yet to see some precipitation for the Buckeyes. So I'm kind of gunning for that at some point to experience that slog-it-out game. Because you talk about Penn State, Ohio State, I just remember the victory bell tolling in the rain after Ohio State won that one. But, I mean, at the end of the day, I think this is going to be one Vegas gets wrong, like Casey said. I think the Buckeyes are putting up 59. And I think Rutgers, we've seen teams score on the Buckeyes because when it gets to that late fourth quarter time, they've got something to prove as well. They got to try to score and lower that spread. I think it's going to be 59-17 Buckeyes.
Are you rooting for rain because I'm on the field and you're under the camera?
I mean, I'm not rooting for rain this week because I've got a wide spread. I'm rooting for rain when we travel to Lansing to make that one a little bit more interesting because I think that would be a great atmosphere to have one of those Big Ten battles in the trenches. So you can sue me. You can say that's, blasphemy, whatever you want to do. But I think that would be a kind of cool experience for Ohio State to go. And that's a different test, right? It's different to go on the road. It's different to play in different conditions. We saw that last year. So I think that would just be a nice little salt on the steak as we exit and prepare for Big Ten battles.
Well, I think that does it for episode 5 of the Lantern Sports Podcast. I'm Stephen Kishpaugh, and for Casey Smith, Jacob Benge, and Gabe Burggraf, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.